By 1780, the South was lost, and with it, the Revolution itself. Charleston's fall in May had been catastrophic, delivering over 5,000 Continental soldiers into British captivity in single worst American defeat of entire war. General Benjamin Lincoln's surrender handed British complete control of South Carolina's most important city and port, leaving Patriot resistance scattered and demoralized throughout region that had become critical battleground. American armies were destroyed through series of defeats that followed Charleston's capture, with Gates routed at Camden in August when he fled battlefield, leaving his army to collapse under British assault. The pattern was unmistakable. British forces dominated South through combination of regular army strength, loyalist militia support, and aggressive commanders who pursued Continental forces relentlessly until American resistance was broken completely. Morale was shattered as patriots throughout South questioned whether independence could be achieved when British military superiority seemed overwhelming, and when Continental Congress could not provide resources necessary to sustain effective resistance. The Revolution teetered on collapse as British consolidated control over Georgia and South Carolina, while preparing to extend conquest into North Carolina and Virginia, threatening to isolate New England from southern colonies and strangle rebellion through strategic division. The South became British stronghold where royal authority was restored and where loyalist populations emerged from hiding to support occupation that seemed permanent. The war no one wanted to fight in South had been fought and lost, leaving Revolution's survival dependent on Northern stalemate and desperate hope that somehow American fortunes could reverse, despite every indication that British Southern strategy was succeeding beyond London's expectations. He wasn't Washington's first choice, but he was his smartest. Nathanael Greene had risen from obscure Quaker ironmaster in Rhode Island to become one of Continental Army's most capable generals through combination of natural intelligence, tireless study of military science, and practical experience gained through years of campaigning alongside Washington. His quiet resolve and preference for careful planning over dramatic gestures made him different from glory-seeking officers who commanded through charisma rather than competence. Greene's intellect distinguished him in army, where many officers relied on courage and instinct rather than systematic strategic thinking. He read military theory obsessively, studied logistics and supply management that other generals considered beneath their attention, and understood that wars were won through coordination of multiple factors rather than through battlefield heroics alone. His approach emphasized endurance over pride, recognizing that survival sometimes mattered more than victory in specific engagements. The reluctant savior was man of contradictions, Quaker who became warrior, intellectual who excelled at practical military operations, modest officer who possessed supreme confidence in his strategic judgment. His background as ironmaster gave him appreciation for logistics and organization that aristocratic European officers lacked, understanding that armies moved on their supply lines and that destroying enemies' capacity to wage war mattered as much as defeating them in battle. Greene's rise demonstrated that American Revolution created opportunities for talent regardless of social background, allowing capable individuals to assume leadership based on merit rather than birth or wealth. His journey from forge to generalship symbolized Revolution's broader transformation of social hierarchy, though Greene himself remained uncomfortable with fame and preferred quiet competence to public celebration of his achievements. When Washington sent Greene south, he sent him into hell. The appointment as commander of Southern Department came in October 1780, after Gates's catastrophic defeat at Camden had destroyed Continental Army's credibility in region and had left British forces dominant throughout South. Greene inherited disaster, scattered remnants of defeated army, hostile or indifferent civilian population, supply system that barely existed, and enemy forces that controlled territory and maintained initiative through aggressive operations. Washington's gamble involved trusting his most capable general to salvage situation that seemed beyond redemption, giving Greene authority to rebuild Southern resistance from virtually nothing. The assignment was recognition of Greene's abilities and acknowledgement that conventional approaches had failed spectacularly under previous commanders who had tried to fight British using methods that played to British strengths, rather than exploiting their weaknesses. One of history's greatest rescues began with almost nothing. Greene arrived to find an army of fewer than 2,000 effective soldiers, most lacking proper clothing and equipment, many sick from inadequate food and shelter, all demoralized by months of defeats. No money existed to pay soldiers or purchase supplies, no functioning supply system could support sustained operations, and no immediate prospect existed for reinforcement from Continental Army forces needed elsewhere. Greene faced seemingly impossible task of rebuilding military resistance in region where British appeared to have won decisively and where American cause seemed hopeless to populations exhausted by years of war. His success would require strategic genius, personal courage, and endurance beyond anything he had previously demonstrated, transforming military disaster into campaign that would eventually drive British from south and create conditions for final American victory at Yorktown. The Empire's best general met America's most cunning. Lord Cornwallis commanded powerful British army that had defeated every continental force opposing it in south, demonstrating tactical skill and aggressive leadership that made him a dangerous opponent. His determination to crush Southern resistance permanently drove relentless pursuit of American forces, refusing to allow them time to recover from defeats or to consolidate positions that might challenge British control. Cornwallis brought professional military expertise and confidence, born from years of successful campaigning, commanding disciplined troops who executed complex maneuvers effectively and who possessed superior equipment and training compared to continental forces they faced. His strategy emphasized decisive battle that would destroy American military capacity and break resistance through demonstration of British military superiority that colonials could not overcome regardless of their motivation, courage. A duel of patience and purpose began as Greene and Cornwallis engaged in strategic contest that would determine South's fate and possibly revolution's outcome. Their approaches were fundamentally different. Cornwallis sought decisive victory through conventional battle, while Greene aimed to preserve his army and exhaust British through war of maneuver and attrition that avoided direct confrontation until circumstances favored American success. The shadow of Cornwallis loomed over Greene's planning as Continental commander understood. He faced an opponent whose tactical skill and aggressive instincts made direct battle extremely dangerous. Greene would need to outthink rather than outfight his adversary, using strategy and deception to neutralize British advantages, while exploiting their weaknesses in ways that Cornwallis's conventional military training had not prepared him to counter effectively. He divided his forces in the face of a superior enemy. Greene's decision to detach Daniel Morgan with portion of his already small army violated military wisdom about maintaining concentration against stronger opponent, but strategic situation demanded bold action rather than cautious defensive positioning. The division allowed Greene to threaten British positions from multiple directions while avoiding concentration that would invite British attack with superior forces that Continental troops could not withstand in direct battle. Greene's first bold move demonstrated his willingness to take calculated risks based on understanding of strategic situation, rather than following conventional military doctrine that circumstances made inappropriate. Detaching Morgan to strike independently in backcountry forced British to divide their forces or accept American raids on supply lines and loyalist populations that supported British occupation. The move created initiative where none had existed, transforming American forces from passive defenders into active threats. A masterstroke of risk and intuition reflected Greene's confidence in his strategic judgment and his trust in Morgan's tactical abilities to operate independently while remaining coordinated with overall campaign plan. The decision required understanding of how to use inferior forces effectively by avoiding direct confrontation while maintaining pressure that forced enemy to respond to American initiatives rather than executing their own plans, unopposed. Splitting army in face of superior enemy became defining characteristic of Greene's southern campaign, demonstrating strategic creativity that confused British commanders, expecting Continental forces to concentrate defensively rather than dispersing to create multiple threats that British lacked resources to counter simultaneously, while maintaining control over occupied territory. While Greene planned, Morgan struck and shattered myth of British invincibility. The victory at Cowpens on January 17, 1781, represented perfect tactical execution, as Morgan's force destroyed Tarleton's elite cavalry through brilliant use of terrain, troop deployment, and enemy psychology. Morgan's triumph demonstrated that Continental forces could defeat British regulars decisively when properly led and strategically positioned, providing psychological boost that revitalized Southern resistance. Morgan's perfect tactical masterpiece validated Greene's strategy of empowering subordinate commanders to operate independently while coordinating their actions with overall campaign objectives. The victory proved that dividing forces created opportunities for American success by forcing British to respond to multiple threats rather than concentrating overwhelming power against single Continental army that they could destroy in conventional battle. Greene's strategy in motion involved more than military operations. It required creating conditions where capable subordinates could exploit opportunities through independent action while maintaining coordination with broader campaign plan. The approach demanded trust in subordinate commanders' judgment and willingness to accept risks that centralized command structure would have prevented, allowing flexibility that British rigid hierarchy could not match. The principle of empower, divide, and force enemy to chase became foundation of Greene's Southern campaign, as he understood that keeping British forces dispersed and reactive prevented them from using superior numbers and training to crush Continental resistance through decisive battle. Cowpens proved the strategy's effectiveness and established pattern that would characterize Southern war until British evacuation. They called it retreat, but it was masterpiece. Greene's famous withdrawal across North Carolina and Virginia through January and February 1781 frustrated Cornwallis's attempts to catch and destroy Continental army that remained tantalizingly close but consistently beyond British reach. The race to Dan River became legend as Greene's forces maintained pace just ahead of pursuing British while destroying boats and supplies that might have allowed Cornwallis to close distance and force battle. Men trudging through mud and rain, keeping one step ahead of pursuers, demonstrated endurance that sustained Greene's strategy of avoiding battle until circumstances favored American success. The physical ordeal tested both armies as winter weather and difficult terrain exhausted soldiers on both sides, but Continental forces possessed advantage of knowing they needed only to stay ahead while British needed to catch them before supplies were exhausted. The British overextended themselves, as Cornwallis drove his army relentlessly in pursuit of enemy he could see but not catch, abandoning supplies and wagons to increase speed, while moving deeper into territory where hostile populations and partisan forces made supply lines vulnerable. The pursuit became a strategic mistake, as British exhausted themselves and their resources chasing army that was leading them into trap of logistics and geography. Greene's withdrawal isolated British forces far from supply bases, while Continental army moved toward friendly territory where reinforcements and supplies could be obtained. The retreat demonstrated that strategic movement could be as valuable as battlefield victory when properly executed with understanding of how logistics and terrain affected military operations in ways that tactical skill alone could not overcome. Every mile Cornwallis gained, he lost strength. The paradox of British pursuit was that apparent success in following Continental army actually weakened British position as supply lines lengthened, provisions diminished, and soldiers exhausted themselves marching through hostile territory without achieving objective of destroying enemy force. Greene understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly through calculated retreats that appeared defensive but were actually offensive operations designed to destroy British capacity to wage war. Greene's use of terrain, logistics, and militia wore British down without requiring full battle that Continental forces might lose. He positioned forces to threaten British flanks and supply lines, forcing Cornwallis to detach troops for protection rather than concentrating all strength for pursuit. Militia harassed British foragers and messengers, making every aspect of British operations more difficult and dangerous, while avoiding direct confrontation with regular British troops who would defeat militia in conventional combat. Strategy as endurance defined Greene's approach. He won by not losing, by preserving his army while British strength diminished through accumulation of small losses and exhaustion that no single battle produced, but that collectively destroyed British capacity to maintain aggressive operations. War by subtraction meant avoiding decisive battles while ensuring that every day of campaigning reduced British effective strength through desertion, disease, supply shortages, and combat losses from partisan attacks. The trap tightened invisibly as Cornwallis pursued enemy he thought was fleeing, but who was actually leading him towards strategic defeat through exhaustion and overextension that brilliant tactical skills could not overcome once logistics made continued operations impossible regardless of battlefield outcomes. It was defeat that felt like victory. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse on March 15, 1781, ended with Continental Army withdrawing from battlefield after fierce fighting against British forces that held the field at day's end, technically winning tactical engagement through superior discipline and professional military execution. But Cornwallis's army suffered devastating casualties that it could not replace while operating far from supply bases in hostile territory surrounded by partisan forces. Greene confronted Cornwallis in North Carolina after receiving reinforcements that brought Continental strength to over 4,000 men, still outnumbered by British, but strong enough to risk battle that might inflict significant casualties, even in defeat. His tactical deployment followed Morgan's Cowpens model, with militia in front lines and Continentals behind, creating layered defense designed to maximize British casualties while allowing American retreat if battle went badly. Tactical loss became strategic triumph as British won battlefield, but lost over 500 casualties, nearly quarter of Cornwallis's effective strength destroyed in single afternoon of brutal combat. The losses were irreplaceable for British force operating far from reinforcements, while Continental Army could absorb its casualties and recruit replacements from local populations. Cornwallis's army was crippled beyond recovery despite winning battle, unable to continue aggressive operations or pursue retreating Continental forces effectively. The outcome validated Greene's strategy of accepting tactical defeats when they produced strategic advantages by destroying British combat power faster than they could destroy Continental capacity to continue resistance. Guilford Courthouse marked turning point where British offensive momentum was broken permanently and where initiative passed to Americans who could now dictate campaign's pace and direction. Greene lost every battle and still won the campaign. The paradox defined Southern war as Continental forces withdrew from battlefield after battlefield, while British position deteriorated strategically through accumulation of casualties, exhaustion, and loss of control over territory they nominally occupied. Cornwallis retreated toward Virginia after Guilford Courthouse, abandoning North Carolina to Continental Army that had not won single major engagement, but that controlled region through persistence and strategic vision. Cornwallis's retreat northward marked collapse of British Southern strategy, as conquered territories fell back under Patriot control once British Army departed. The southern colonies began turning as populations recognized that British occupation was temporary and that Continental resistance would eventually triumph through endurance, even when losing individual battles. Loyalist support evaporated as populations hedged their commitments to avoid retaliation from Patriots who would control region once British withdrew. British control disintegrated throughout South as Greene's forces and partisan militias reclaimed countryside that British had conquered during 1780. Patriot militias emerged from hiding to attack isolated British garrisons and Loyalist settlements, reversing pattern where British had dominated through military superiority and aggressive operations. The momentum shift was psychological as much as military, demonstrating that British could not maintain occupation against determined population resistance. The campaign's outcome proved that wars are not won merely through battlefield victories, but through destroying enemies' capacity and will to continue fighting, that strategic patience can overcome tactical defeats, and that controlling territory matters more than winning battles when population supports resistance against occupying force regardless of military outcomes. The war in South was not line of battles, it was map of endurance. Greene's relentless maneuvering through South Carolina during spring and summer 1781 involved series of engagements at Hobkirk's Hill, 96, and Eutaw Springs, where Continental forces fought British garrisons and relief columns without winning decisive victories, but gradually reducing British control to Charleston and immediate surroundings. Each engagement weakened British position, while demonstrating American determination to contest every British-held position. Greene understood that persistence was weapon when used systematically against enemy whose resources were finite and whose political support for prolonged conflict was weakening. He maintained continuous pressure on British forces through combination of conventional military operations and partisan warfare that prevented British from consolidating control or resting between campaigns. The Carolina War became war of attrition, where American advantages in local knowledge and population support gradually overwhelmed British military superiority. Bleeding empire dry required accepting continued sacrifice and frustration of fighting battles that produced no clear victories, but that collectively achieved strategic objective of making British occupation unsustainable. Greene's willingness to fight without winning demonstrated strategic vision that looked beyond individual engagements, to understand how accumulated pressure could force enemy to abandon positions they could defend tactically but not maintain strategically. The map of endurance showed British control shrinking steadily as Continental forces reclaimed territory through sustained operations that British could not counter without resources they no longer possessed or political will that was evaporating as war's costs mounted without producing decisive British victory that might have justified continued investment in suppressing Southern resistance. He was winning, but it was killing him. Greene's personal suffering during Southern campaign included chronic illness that weakened him physically, while emotional exhaustion from constant decision-making and responsibility for soldiers' lives wore down his spirit. Despite outward appearance of confident leadership, the campaigning involved continuous movement through difficult terrain in harsh climate without adequate rest or proper nutrition, making physical demands that would have broken less determined commanders. Illness and exhaustion plagued Greene throughout campaign as he pushed himself and his army beyond normal human endurance to maintain pressure on British forces that could not be allowed respite to recover strength or consolidate positions. His letters revealed suffering that public statements concealed, describing physical pain and mental fatigue that made continued operations seem impossible, even as he planned next maneuvers and coordinated complex military operations across entire Southern theatre. The emotional toll of command without glory affected Greene deeply as he watched soldiers suffer and die in campaign that produced no dramatic victories to justify their sacrifices, winning through accumulated small successes that contemporaries barely noticed while fixating on battlefield outcomes that favoured British tactically. The cost of genius included loneliness of pursuing strategy that few others understood, and accepting criticism from those who judged success by battle outcomes rather than strategic results. Greene's suffering demonstrated that leadership's price included personal sacrifice that went beyond physical danger to encompass emotional burden of responsibility and isolation of command, where decisions affected thousands of lives and where mistakes could doom revolution, regardless of individual courage or dedication. Greene chased him to edge of defeat, and Washington finished job. Cornwallis's retreat to Yorktown was consequence of Greene's Southern campaign that had destroyed British Army's effectiveness and forced British commander to seek coastal position where Royal Navy could supply and eventually evacuate forces that could no longer operate effectively inland. Greene's campaign drove Cornwallis north into Virginia, where combined American and French forces would trap and destroy British Army in October 1781. The Southern War became war's endgame, as British defeat at Yorktown resulted directly from strategic situation that Greene had created through year of relentless campaigning that exhausted British forces and forced them into vulnerable position. Without Greene's success in destroying British Southern strategy, Cornwallis would never have retreated to Virginia, where he could be trapped by convergence of Continental and French forces that Washington orchestrated. The fall of Cornwallis vindicated Greene's strategic vision and demonstrated that his Southern campaign was not a series of defeats, but brilliant strategic success that achieved objective of destroying British capacity to maintain Southern occupation. His contribution to Yorktown victory was essential, though often overlooked in celebrations that focused on dramatic siege rather than on year-long campaign that made siege possible by forcing British into position where they could be trapped. Greene's campaign proved that strategic patience and tactical flexibility could overcome enemies' battlefield superiority when pursued systematically, with understanding of how accumulated pressure could force enemy into positions where conventional advantages became liabilities, and where final defeat became inevitable regardless of tactical skills or professional military superiority. When world celebrated Washington, Greene faded into silence. The forgotten victor received little recognition for campaign that had saved South and created conditions for Yorktown victory that ended British military efforts to suppress revolution. Public attention focused on dramatic siege and Washington's leadership, while Greene's complex maneuvering and strategic brilliance were understood by few contemporaries who could appreciate how difficult his achievement had been, given resources available and strategic situation he had inherited. Greene's quiet withdrawal from fame, despite shaping victory that made Yorktown possible, reflected his personality and his understanding that public celebration mattered less than accomplishing mission he had been assigned. He returned to civilian life without seeking political office or public honors, content with private satisfaction of knowing he had saved revolution through a year of brilliant campaigning that few recognized as military genius comparable to any achieved during war. History's tendency to remember battles rather than minds that made them possible meant Greene's contribution was minimized in favor of more dramatic moments that captured public imagination. Yorktown's siege was visible and conclusive, while Southern campaign was a complex series of movements and engagements whose strategic significance required understanding military theory that most people lacked. Greene became historical footnote while less capable generals received lasting fame. The forgotten victor's fate demonstrated that true strategic genius often goes unrecognized because it produces results through methods that seem anticlimactic compared to battlefield heroics, that success through endurance and patience lacks drama that captures popular imagination, and that greatest military achievements sometimes involve avoiding battles rather than winning them. He never won battle, but he never lost campaign. Greene's brilliance lay in understanding that strategic success mattered more than tactical victories, that preserving army, while destroying enemy capacity for sustained operations, could achieve objectives that conventional military victories might not accomplish. His methods emphasized logistics, mobility, morale management, and asymmetrical warfare that exploited enemy weaknesses while avoiding their strengths, creating an approach to military operations fundamentally different from conventional European warfare. Analysis of Greene's Southern campaign reveals lessons about how inferior forces can defeat superior opponents through strategic creativity and operational flexibility. His willingness to divide forces, accept tactical defeats, and pursue indirect approaches demonstrated that military success required adapting methods to circumstances rather than following doctrine that circumstances made inappropriate. His legacy influenced military thought far beyond immediate context of American Revolution. Greene's methods echo through centuries of military thought, as strategists studied his campaign to understand how he achieved strategic success through tactical defeats, how logistics and mobility could overcome numerical and professional disadvantages, and how psychological factors and population support could determine outcomes regardless of battlefield results. His influence extended to modern concepts of asymmetrical warfare, where weaker forces use indirect methods to overcome conventionally superior enemies. The strategist's legacy transcends specific battles, or even revolution itself, to represent enduring truth that wars are won through destroying enemies' capacity and will to fight rather than through accumulating battlefield. Victories. That strategic vision matters more than tactical skill when forces are mismatched, and that patience combined with systematic pressure can achieve objectives that direct confrontation cannot accomplish. Without Greene, there would have been no Yorktown and no United States. His Southern campaign saved revolution when British control of South threatened to divide colonies and strangle resistance through strategic isolation. Greene's ability to rebuild shattered army, outmaneuver superior British forces, and gradually reclaim occupied territory, demonstrated leadership and strategic genius that made American independence achievable rather than merely aspirational. Reflection on Greene's enduring influence reveals hidden heroism of patience, intellect, and sacrifice that sustained revolution through darkest period when military situation appeared hopeless. His contribution exceeded Washington's in strategic innovation and exceeded any other general's in achieving results with inadequate resources against superior enemy. Yet his achievements remained largely unrecognized because they lacked drama that captured public imagination. The general who saved revolution embodied qualities essential to successful resistance against imperial power: strategic creativity that adapted to circumstances, moral courage to pursue unpopular strategies, personal endurance that sustained operations despite illness and exhaustion, and intellectual humility that allowed learning from defeats without abandoning ultimate objectives. These qualities made him an irreplaceable figure whose contribution to American independence was as essential as any founder's. Revolution's final victory wasn't born in glory, it was earned in endurance by man who refused to break despite defeats, suffering, and lack of recognition that would have discouraged less determined commander. Greene proved that independence required not just battlefield heroics but sustained strategic vision, that winning sometimes meant losing battles while destroying enemies' capacity for continued resistance, and that greatest military achievements often come from those who understand war as test of endurance rather than series of dramatic confrontations. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.